The translator should look upon himself as a merchant in the intellectual exchange of the world, whose business it is to promote the interchange of the produce of the mind. Goethe, Kunst und Altertum. The publishers of this little volume, in requesting me to undertake a translation of the Incendio Vesuviano of Professor Palmieri, and to accompany it with some introductory remarks, I felt justified by the facts that Signor Palmieri's position as a physicist, the great advantages which his long residence in Naples as a professor of the university and for many years past director of the meteorological observatory, established upon Vesuvius itself prior to the expulsion of the late dynasty, have naturally caused much weight to attach to anything emanating from his pen in reference to that volcano. Nearly 40 memoirs on various branches of physics, chiefly electricity, magnetism, and meteorology, produced since 1842, are to be found under Palmieri's name in the Universal Catalogue of Scientific Papers of the Royal Society. And of these nine referred to Vesuvius, the earliest being entitled Primi studi meteorologici fatti sul observatorio Vesuviano. Published in 1853, he was also author, in conjunction with Professor A. Scacchi, of an elaborate report upon the volcanic region of Monte Vulture and of the earthquake commonly called of Melfi of 1851. These, however, by no means exhaust the stock of Palmieri's labors. The following memoir of Signor Palmieri on the eruption of Vesuvius in April of this year, 1872, brief as it is, embraces two distinct subjects, viz., his narrative as an eyewitness of the actual events of the eruption, as they occurred upon the cone and slopes of the mountain, and his observations as to the pulses emanating from its interior as indicated by his seismograph, and as to the electric conditions of the overhanging cloud of smoke, so-called, and ashes, as indicated by his bifilar electrometer, both established at the observatory. The two last have but an indirect bearing upon volcanology. The narrative of the events of the eruption is characterized by exactness of observation and a sobriety of language, so widely different from the exaggerated style of sensational writing that is found in almost all such accounts, that I do the author no more than justice in thus expressing my view of its merits. Nor should a special narration such as this become less important, or suffer even in popular estimation by the fact that so recently my friend Professor J. Phillips has given to the world the best general account of Vesuvius and its historical and some of its scientific aspects which has yet appeared. That monograph, with its sparkling style and scholarly digressions, as well as for its more direct merits, will no doubt become the manual for many a future visitor to the volcanic regions of Naples. But it, like the following memoir of Palmieri, and in common with almost every work that has appeared on the subject of volcanoes, contains a good deal which, however interesting and remotely related to volcanology, does not properly belong to the body of that branch of cosmical science as I understand its nature and limits. It tends but little, for example, to clear our views or enlarge our knowledge of the vast mechanism in which the volcano originates, and that by which its visible mass is formed, and that we should ascertain the electric condition of the atmosphere above its eruptive cone, or in what crystallographic classes the mineral species found about it may be divided, it will help us but little to know Pliny's notion. It will help us but little to know Pliny's notions of how Pompeii was overwhelmed, or to re-engrave pictures assumed to give the exact shape of the Vesuvian or other cone at different periods, or its precise altitude, which are ever varying above the sea. Even much more time and labor may be spent upon analyzing the vapors and gases of fumaroles and salfatares than the results can now justify. Nothing perhaps tends more to the effective progress of any branch of observational and inductive science than that we should endeavor to discern clearly the scope and boundary of our subject. To do so is but to accord with Bacon's maxim, prudens quaestio de medium scientiae, that once shaped, the roads or methods of approach become clear, and every foothold attained upon these direct paths enable us to look back upon such collateral or subordinate questions as at first perplexed us, and find them so illuminated that they are already probably solved, and by solution again prove to us that we are in the right paths. I believe, therefore, that I shall not do disservice to the grand portion of cosmical physics in which volcanic phenomena belong by devoting the few pages accorded to me for this introduction to sketching what seems to me to be the present position of terrestrial volcanicity, and tracing the outlines and relations of the two branches of scientific investigation, volcanology and seismology, by which its true nature and part in the cosmos are chiefly to be ascertained. The general term volcanicity properly comprehends all that we see or know of actions taking place upon and modifying the surface of our globe, which are referable not to forces of origin above the surface and acting superficially, but to causes that have been or are in operation beneath it. It embraces all that Humboldt has somewhat vaguely called the reactions of the interior of a planet upon its exterior. These reactions show themselves principally and mainly in the marking out and configuration of the great continents and ocean beds, in the forcing up of mountain chains, and in the varied phenomena consequent thereon, as seen in more or less adjacent formations. These constitute the mechanism which has molded and fashioned the surface of our globe from the period when it first became superficially solid, and prepared it as the theater for the action of all those superficial actions, such as those of tides, waves, rain, rivers, solar heat, frost, vitality, vegetable and animal, passing by many other less obvious which perpetually modify, alter, or renew the surface of our world and maintain the existing regimen of the great machine and of its inhabitants. These last are the domain of geology, properly so called. No geological system can be well-founded or can completely explain the working of the world system as we now see it, that does not start from volcanicity, as thus defined, and this is equally true whether, as do most geologists, we include within the term geology everything we can know about our world as a whole, exclusive of what astronomy teaches us to it, dividing geology in general into physical geology, the boundaries of which are very indistinct, and stratigraphical geology, whose limits are equally so. Limits. It has been often said that geology, in this widest sense, begins with where astronomy or cosmogony ends its information as to our globe, but this is scarcely true. Volcanicity or geology, if we choose to make it comprehend that, must commence its survey of our world as a nebula, upon which for unknown ages thermic, gravitant, and chemical forces were operative, and to the final play of which the form, density, and volume, as well as order of this deposition of the different elements in the order of their chemical combination. And deposition was due when first our globe became a liquid or partly liquid spheroid, and which have equally determined the chemical nature of the materials of the outward rind of the earth that now is, and with these some of the primary conditions that have fixed the characters, nature, and interdependence of the vegetables and animals that inhabit it. Physical astronomy and physical geology through volcanicity thus overlap each other. The first does not end where the second begins, and in every sure attempt to bring geology to that pinnacle, which is the proper ideal of its completed design, namely the interpretation of our world's machine, as part of the universal cosmos, as far as that can ever become known to our limited observation and intelligence. We must carry with us astronomic considerations. We must keep in view events anterior to the status consistentior of Leibniz, nor lose sight of the fact that the chain of causation is one, endless, and unbroken. That forces first set moving, we know not when or how, the dim remoteness of which imagination tries to sound in shadowy thought, like those of the grand old Eastern poem, when the morning stars first sang together, are however changed in form, operative still the light and fragile butterfly, whose glorious garb irradiates the summer zephyr, in which it floats, has had its power of flight, which is its power to live, determined by results of that same chain of causes that lifted from the depths of the mountain on whose sunny side he floats, that has determined the seasons and the color of the flower whose nectar he sucks, and that discharges or dissipates the storm above, that may crush the insect and the blossom in which it passed. And thus, as had been said, it was not all a myth, that in older days affirmed that in some mysterious way the actions and the lives of men were linked to the stars in their courses, whatever may have been the manifestation of volcanicity at former and far remoter epochs of our planet, and to which I shall return. In the existing state of regimen of and upon our globe, it shows itself chiefly in the phenomena of volcanoes and of earthquakes, which are the subjects of volcanology and of seismology respectively, and in principal part also of this introduction. The phenomena of hot springs, geysers, etc., which might be included under the title of thermopagology, have certain relations to both, but more immediately to volcanology. Let us now glance at the history and progress of knowledge in these two chief domains of volcanicity, preparatory to a sketch of its existing stage as to both, and, by the way, attempt to extract a lesson as to the methods by which such success and as has attended our labors has been achieved. It will be most convenient to treat of seismology first in order. Aristotle, who devotes a larger space of his fourth book to earthquakes, Seneca, Pliny, Strabo, in the so-called classic days, and thence to no end, of writers down to about the end of the 17th century, amongst whom Fromondi, 1527, and Travaglini, 1679, are perhaps the most important now, have filled volumes with records of facts, or what they took to be such, of earthquakes, and handed down to or observed by themselves, and with plenty of hypotheses as to their nature and origin, but sterile of much real knowledge. Hooke's Discourses of Earthquakes, read before the Royal Society about 1690, afford a curious example of how abuse of words, once given by authority, clings as a hindrance to progress. He He had formed no distinct idea of what he meant by an earthquake, and so confusedly mixes up all elevations or depressions of a permanent character with subversions, conversions, and transpositions of parts of the earth, however sudden or transitory, under the name of earthquakes. A like confusion is far from uncommon amongst geological writers, even at the present day, and examples might be quoted from very late writings of even some of the great leaders of English geology. From the 17th to the middle of the 18th century, one finds floods of hypotheses from Flamsteed, Hottinger, Amontons, Stukely, Beccaria, Percival, Priestley, and a crowd of others, in which electricity, then attracting so much attention, is often called upon to supply causation for a something of which no clear idea has been formed. Count Byland's singular work, published in 1835, through showing a curious partial insight in point of advancement, might be put back into that preceding period. In 1760, appeared the very remarkable paper in the 51st volume of the Philosophical Transactions of the Reverend John Mitchell of Cambridge, in which he views an earthquake as a sudden lifting up by a rapid evolution of steam or gas beneath of a portion of the earth's crust, and the lateral transfer of this gaseous bubble beneath the earth's crust bent to follow its shape and motion, or that of a wave of liquid rock beneath, like a carpet shaken on earth. Great as are certain collateral merits of Mitchell's paper, showing observation of various sorts much in advance of his time, this notion of an earthquake is such as, had he applied to it even the imperfect knowledge of mechanics and physics, and possessed in a definite manner, he could scarcely have failed to see its untenable nature. That the same notion, and in a far more extravagant form, should have been reproduced in 1843 by Messrs. Rogers, by whom the gigantic parallel anticlinals, flanks, and valleys of the whole Appalachian chain of mountains are taken for nothing more than the indurated foldings and wrinkles of Mitchell's carpet, is one of the most salient examples of the abuse of hypotheses untested by exact science. Neither Humboldt nor Darwin, great as were the opportunities of observation enjoyed by both, can be supposed to have formed any definite idea of what an earthquake is, and the latter, who had observed well the effects of great sea waves rolling inshore after the shock, did not establish any clear relation between the two. For a fuller account of the literature and history of advancement of human knowledge as to earthquakes, here merely glanced at, I must refer to my first report on the facts of earthquakes, Reports British Association 1850, and to the works of Dominic Lyell, Phillips, and others, in complete history remaining yet to be written. Hitherto, no one appears to have formed any clear notion as to what an earthquake is. That is to say, any clear idea of what is the nature of the movement constituting the shock, no matter what may be the nature or origin of the movement itself. That is to say, any clear idea of what is the nature of the movement constituting the shock, no matter what may be the nature or origin of the movement itself. The first glimmering of such an idea, so far as my reading has enabled me to ascertain, is due to the penetrating genius of Dr. Thomas Young, who in his lectures on natural philosophy published in 1807 casually suggests the probability that earthquake motions are vibratory and analogous to those of sound. Yet how indistinctly formed were Young's ideas, and indistinct in the same direction as those of Humboldt, becomes evident by a single sentence. When the agitation produced by an earthquake extends further than there is any reason to suspect a subterraneous communication, it is probably propagated through the earth nearly in the same manner as a noise is conveyed through the air. This was rendered somewhat more definite by Gay-Lussac, who in an able paper on the chemical theories of volcanoes in the 22nd volume of the Annales de Chimie in 1823 says, En amont, les tremblements de terre ne sont que la propagation d'une commotion à travers la masse de la terre, tellement indépendante des cavités souterraines qu'elle s'intensifie s'étendrait d'autant plus loin que la Terre serait plus homogène. These suggestions of Jung and of Gay-Lussac, as may be seen, only refer to the movement in the more or less solid crust of the Earth. But 2, if not 3, other great movements were long known to frequently accompany earthquake shocks. The recession of the sea from the shore just about the moment of shock, the terrible sounds of the subterraneous growling, which sometimes preceded, sometimes accompanied, and sometimes followed the shock, and the great sea wave, which rose in shore more or less long after it remained still unbroken as to their nature. They had been recognized only as a concomitant but unconnected phenomena, the more inexplicable because sometimes present, sometimes absent, and wholly without any known mutual bearing or community of cause. On the 9th February 1846, I communicate to the Royal Irish Academy my paper on the dynamics of earthquakes, printed in volume 21, part 1 of the Transactions of that Academy, and published the same year, in which it was my good fortune to have been able to colligate the observed facts and bringing them together under the light of the known laws of production and propagation of vibratory waves in elastic, solid, liquid, and gaseous bodies, and of the production and propagation of liquid waves of translation in water varying in depth, to prove that all the phenomena of earthquake shocks could be accounted for by a single impulse given at a single center.